I think it's time to put the hurt on the Ukraine.
I come from Ukraine. You not say Ukraine weak?
Yeah, well, we're playing a game here, pal.
Ukrainians came to you? How about I take your little Boris?
It should come as no surprise to most people that Ukrainians have one of the strongest senses of national pride in all of Europe today, and indeed the Ukrainian people have gone through such a multitude of tribulations. It's a bit surprising that the nation of Ukraine has survived through the centuries. Even the name of Ukraine's national anthem, Ukraine has not yet perished, reflects this reality that many have faced. In fact, for most of its modern history, Ukraine and neighboring Eastern Slavic Republic, Belarus, were essentially giant battlegrounds, and during World War II, Ukraine and Belarus had one of the highest rates of death of any area, not only in Europe, but in the entire world, with 16 and 25% of the entire civilian population either perishing from warfare, massacres, or disease, with nearly 7 million dying in Ukraine alone. In World War I, however, Ukraine actually didn't come out half bad, as the Soviet Union, of course, dropped out of the Great War before it could come to a crescendo, but it was actually Ukraine's very own government that caused one of the most devastating events to ever occur in the downtrodden state. The Holodomor of 1932 was a famine that struck Ukraine and many other ethnic Ukrainian-populated areas of the Soviet Union between these two unprecedented wars, and left anywhere from 2 to 10 million people dead, and is sometimes referred to as the Ukrainian Genocide because of the mass devastation released on the Ukrainian population in particular. The Holodomor was a part of a wider catastrophe known as the Soviet Famine of 1932, which also affected the Caucasus, Siberia, and especially Kazakhstan, where an estimated 1.5 million people died, or approximately 40% of the ethnic Kazakh population, which, in addition to the Holodomor, fundamentally changed the demographics and political attitude of ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union forever. It's generally accepted that these two disasters were directly man-made, or at the very least exacerbated by the government of the USSR at the time, mostly Joseph Stalin, in order to weaken the Ukrainian nation and other Soviet republics that were teetering on rebellion. And this is evidenced by the censorship of data regarding the disaster and the rejection of foreign aid by the Soviet government during this crisis, which could have greatly alleviated many areas of the country. Before we delve into the effects of the Holodomor on historical events, let's discuss just what led up to the incident in the first place and a brief history of Ukraine and ethnic Ukrainians, who for a great while were actually referred to as Little Russians and Ukraine as Little Rus, being a part of the old Kievan Rus, which was naturally centered around Kiev. Interestingly, the area that makes up modern Ukraine has had a very extensive history of being conquered by outside powers, including the Huns, Goths, Mongols, and a plethora of Turkic peoples such as the Cumans, Bulgars, Khazars, and Kipchaks, the latter of which evolved into the Crimean Tatars of the Crimean Peninsula. But over the centuries, these Turkic Muslim peoples were gradually pushed further south, while the area that became Ukraine was becoming more Slavic. During this time in the 18th century, a unique class emerged in the region known as the Cossacks, who are quite an enigma even to this day. The Cossacks were monumentally important in the Slavic conquests of many regions of the former Russian Empire, including southern Ukraine, the Caucasus region, and of course Siberia. And despite this, there is much debate as to just who they were. Because the Cossacks never had their own unique language, it's very difficult to categorize them by ethnicity, as some claim them to simply be ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, or their own thing entirely, even ethnic Khazars who were Slavicized over the centuries. However, the majority of Cossacks spoke the Balachka dialect of Ukrainian and were considered ethnically Ukrainian in Russian and Soviet censuses, although many Cossacks identified as ethnically Turkic or even Jewish. Because of their heavy involvement in the Russian military, many Cossacks, such as Yermak Timofeyevich, carved a path through the Siberian tundra, conquering the native Turkic and other North Asian tribes, and hence were viewed as national heroes by many in the Russian Empire, and allowed to settle many areas, mostly in the southern portion of Russia, and especially the frontier regions, such as the Far East near the Sea of Okhotsk. Outside of Ukraine, the largest area of settlement for ethnic Ukrainians was directly east of their traditional homeland in the area known as Kuban in the northern Caucasus, and similarly to southern Ukraine, the area was previously inhabited by an Islamic group known as the Circassians up until the mid-1800s. Large numbers of ethnic Russians, Belarusians, Germans, but especially Ukrainians, started to settle in the region of Kuban, and by the Russian census in 1897, ethnic Ukrainians, a large proportion of whom identified as Cossacks, accounted for 47% of the population of Kuban Oblast, and during this time the Cossack identity and migration was actively promoted by the state. On the other side of the continent, large numbers of Ukrainians were also settling in the newly acquired Russian territory on the border with China, and the empire had no problem allowing large numbers of Ukrainians and other minorities to settle in the region as a buffer zone, especially the port city of Vladivostok and Primorsky Krai, with the area soon being known as Green Ukraine or Eastern Ukraine. And this was around the same area where the Jewish Autonomous Oblast was established in 1934. So by all indication, Cossacks and Ukrainians in general were faring very well in the Russian Empire, admired by both the state and their fellow countrymen. But this all changed when the entire Ukrainian nation caught the ire of a certain mustache supervillain. Unbeknownst to them at the time, the Russian Revolution following World War I would spell out the untimely demise for the Cossack community and the start of the decline for the Ukrainian presence and influence in the Russian Empire, which would eventually set up the scene for the Holodomor in the first place. The Cossacks, for the most part, were staunchly anti-communist and loyal to the Tsarist regime, and this was also true for most Ukrainians as well, who no longer wished to be a part of the empire, and many Russians saw them as sympathizers with the German Empire. During the Ukrainian War of Independence, several other regions of the Russian Empire with a large Ukrainian population rebelled against the Bolsheviks and declared independence, including Kuban as the Kuban People's Republic and Green Ukraine as the Far East Republic, and it can be argued that ethnic Ukrainians were not directly responsible for these rebellions, but they were heavily involved in anti-communist movements. Even following the victory of the communists, the crushing of the rebellions, and the establishment of the USSR in 1922, tensions between the ethnicities of the Soviet republics didn't diminish, and this led to the Holodomor and the policy of de-Cossacization, where Cossacks were targeted by the Soviet state for extinction because of their previous resistance, and huge numbers were taken from their traditional homelands to be exiled in the far reaches of Siberia, Kazakhstan, or scattered throughout other areas of Russia. And following the Holodomor, the vast majority of the Ukrainian and Cossack populations in the Caucasus and Primorsky had either been relocated or forcibly assimilated. For all intents and purposes, this was the extinction of the Cossack people as a separate class, but in the Russian Federation today there are a handful of self-identified Cossacks who have been recognized as an independent ethnic group and have around a 90% genetic similarity with modern Ukrainians, with an almost identical haplogroup makeup, aside from a slight overrepresentation of haplogroup G, which is predominant in the Caucasian region, and haplogroup J2, which is native to the northern Middle East. But this absolutely makes sense from a geographic and historical standpoint, seeing as to how Kuban Cossacks no doubt mingled with the previous populations upon arrival. Now, if the Holodomor and other anti-Ukrainian pogroms were never enacted by the Soviet government, it would be quite hard to predict how the politics of the Soviet Union would play out, or if the Union could have even survived as long as it did, seeing how a Ukrainian majority in these regions would have certainly caused tensions between a Ukrainian and Russian SSR over these territories, similar to what we can already see, such as the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the other Russian majority areas of Ukraine, such as in Donbass, where a large separatist movement has taken hold. Had the Holodomor never occurred, these conflicts would not exist, and in fact a reverse would be much more likely, with ethnic Ukrainians instead vying for their own independent state in the region, or perhaps even full integration with Ukraine, which could result in the Northern Caucasus seceding from a post-Soviet Russia entirely, meaning an independent Dagestan, Chechnya, Ossetia, and other small Caucasian republics. One of the biggest changes would certainly be seen in demographics, as currently, despite having one of the larger populations of any European country, Ukraine is going through a bit of a demographic crisis as the population plummets by over 100,000 people every year due to a high rate of emigration to Western Europe and North America, America, a low life expectancy, and extremely low fertility rate. Ukraine's population has plummeted from over 52 million right after the fall of the USSR to only 44 million as of 2018, and this population decline would be even worse if it weren't for ethnic Ukrainians from other areas of the former USSR emigrating to Ukraine in the past few decades. The Holodomor certainly didn't help with this. In many areas of Ukraine and other ethnic Ukrainian areas, such as the Kuban region, up to 1 in 4 died of starvation in only a 4-year period, which was absolutely devastating to the population, although this was partially offset by huge numbers of ethnic Russians migrating to the region in the following decades, similar to what happened in Kazakhstan. Ukraine's population would likely be far higher as the Ukrainians never fully recovered, as the fertility rate in Ukraine fell dramatically in the decades between 1930 and 50, and although it's impossible to predict, by extrapolating the data, Ukraine would have a population 10 to 20% higher than it is now, although there could be some sort of greater Ukrainian state formed after the fall of the Soviet Union, encompassing even more territory and inhabitants. One interesting possibility is that Ukraine doesn't collaborate with the Axis powers during World War II, or at least far fewer Ukrainians support the Nazi regime, because there would be far less anti-Soviet sentiment among ethnic Ukrainians at the time, which admittedly wouldn't change too much as the Axis powers would still lose the war, and truthfully, perhaps the political situation of the region wouldn't really change too much in the end. And I certainly don't want this to be an anti-Russian video, or even an anti-Stalin video, as in the end, we've all come to love him, let's face it. So I'll leave you a poll on what you think Ukraine would look like had the Holodomor not taken the lives of 2 to 10 million Ukrainians, and be sure to give your own theories on how this would play out from the 1930s to the present day. And as always, thank you all for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.